Now that we have some understanding of variables and user inputs, let's take a look at how we can manipulate user inputs with some simple operations that are relatively common inside of different applications. So let's say that we want to take in two numbers from a user, and then we want to add those two numbers together and display that result to the user. So what we can do is we can say something like this. We can go, let's say number 1 equals input, please enter the first number. And we could say num2 equals input, please enter the second number. And then what we can do is we can essentially just add these two numbers together and then display that result onto the screen. Now, there are a few things we're going to have to do before we just add the numbers together. So, the way that we would add two numbers together typically is we would do something like this. So we could say like, I don't know, answer equals num1 plus num2, and then we can print out answer. However, you'll notice if you do just that, you're going to get something rather weird. So you'll see if I input like the first number is 2 and the second number is 3, you'll see I get 23. Now this obviously isn't the answer that we're expecting. What happens is when a user provides an input to Python, Python interprets that input as text. So when we do num1 plus num2, what it does is it combines the two pieces of text together, or concatenates them together, and it gives us 23 because it gives us the first number and then the second number following it. What we want to do is we want to tell Python to treat these numbers as numbers, not as text. There's a few different ways that you can do this. So I'm going to show you one way that we could do this right now. What we could do is we could say number 1 equals int num1. What this will do is it will tell Python that number that you just got as an input from the user, you should treat that as an integer. And as we discussed, integers are just numbers that don't have any decimals, right? So we'll treat it as an integer value. And similarly, we could say num2 equals int of num2. When we do this and run it, you'll see that we'll get something that looks more like what we're expecting. I can input 2 and then 3, and you'll see I get 5. So you can see that this is a good solution to this problem. Now, there is one other way that you could have done this. Rather than having these two variables set again, we can actually do it all in one line. I could say int, and then in brackets, the input. What this will do is it will get the input from the user. So say I input 2. This inner part would be 2, and then it takes the int of that value. So it says, take that input from the user. Okay, now interpret that input as an integer, right? So it just puts it all on one line rather than having it on separate lines. So this is a little bit more effective in terms of saving space. You'll see that when we do this, we get the exact same result. So it really just depends on what you prefer. You can do one or the other. They're both equivalent to each other. In the end, when you do this, in most languages, if you have a compiler, the compiler will simplify the logic anyways. So it doesn't really matter which you do. It just matters which is more readable, which is easier to understand, right? So now one other thing that you might notice is we're treating these as integers. So what if someone inputs like a decimal value? We could take a look at that. If I enter like 2.1, you'll see I get an invalid literal for int of base 10. Essentially what happens here is, since we're telling it to treat it as an integer, if someone inputs like a floating point or decimal value, Python doesn't know what to do with it. It says, this isn't an integer, and it creates an error like this. So if you ever see this error, it's telling you that this isn't a valid integer, which it isn't, right? So rather than using int, if we want to allow decimal values, we can say float instead. Float is another word for decimal. It's typically the one that's used for Python. So when we run this, if I put in like 2.1 and maybe 3.4, you'll see it adds them together and treats them as floating point or decimal numbers. So this would be the way that you would handle that. In general, if you're expecting numbers to be inputted and you don't really care whether they're decimal or integers, you should use floating point as your variable of type, unless you have like significantly large numbers, in which case there are other types that you could use for that. But we're just going to assume that you have relatively small floating point numbers, so float is a good use for that. So this shows you how you can convert these values into actually numbers so that Python will interpret them properly, right? So we'll keep these as floating points, and we'll discuss a few other operations that exist. So obviously you can add numbers together, and it would be pretty intuitive that you can also subtract numbers using the minus sign. A few other things that you could do is you can multiply numbers together. So if you multiply numbers together, right, you're able to do that operation. You can also divide numbers. So multiply is with the asterisk, which is Shift 8 on your keyboard, and then the backslash is for division. Now there are a few other more sort of like obscure, I guess, operations that you may not be as familiar with. One of them is what's called modulus, which is represented by a % sign. This is actually known as the remainder after division. So when you divide two numbers, sometimes there's a remainder. This will tell you what the remainder of the division is. So let me give you an example. If I input in, let's say 8 and 3, you'll see that the remainder is 2. Because 8 goes, or if you divide 3 and 8, right? It would be 2 times, which would be 6, and then 8 minus 6 would be 2. So the remainder is 2, of course. Now you might be wondering, why would we ever use an operator like modulus? It's actually very useful in a lot of different instances. Take, for example, if you want to check if a number is even or odd. What you can do is you can modulus it with 2. If the value mod 2 is equal to 0, then it's even. If it's equal to 1, then it's odd. So that's one application of this sort of operation. One other type of operation that you can do is an exponent, which is using 2 multiplication signs. I mentioned this one because a lot of people will often try this. This is not exponents. This is actually, I believe, bitwise or XOR, I think. So that's not exponents regardless. Exponents is done with 2 multiplication signs like this. So just keep that in mind. So again, an example, like if you want to do 2 to the power of 3, you'll see it gets us 8. So that's an example of that. And then one final one that's relatively interesting is floor division, which is 2 backslashes. I'll show this one with the example of 8 and 3. So let's say 8 and 3. You'll see I get back 2.0. Now, if we were to do this with just the single backslash to do normal division, what you'll see is that when we do 8 and 3, it gives us 2.6. What this is it's essentially integer division. It gives you the piece that comes before the decimal, and it just cuts out the whole decimal portion of it. So it essentially sets up division so that you only get the integer result of it back. So this is, again, useful if you want to like divide 2 numbers and get back something that isn't a decimal, but like sort of like a close approximation. That sort of instance would be helpful. So this is used in a lot of different algorithms, and you'll tend to see it in a lot of different places. But it's just good to know about this operation for now, just in case you ever come into an instance where you want to be able to use that. So one further thing that I want to discuss here in terms of operations is the different types of assignments that exist for variables. So you'll notice that every single time that we've been assigning variables, we're saying like the variable equals something, right? You don't always actually have to do that. For example, if I want to add 2 numbers together, I can actually do it using just 2 variables. What we can do is we can say number 1 plus, or we could say, we would say number 1 plus equals. Please enter the second number. What this will do is when the person inputs the first number, it places it into number 1. When the person inputs the second number, plus equals will retrieve the value of number 1 that's currently there, and then it will add what is on the other side of the equal sign. So what this does is it essentially adds this value to this value here. You'll see if I input something like 3 and 2, I'll still get 5, right? It's because this is equal to 3, and then this input is equal to 2, so it retrieves 3, and then it adds on the result of this, which is 2. So this is another one that's relatively common. You'll see it if we ever want to like add 1 to a number. Oftentimes we'll do like num1 plus equals 1. Because if you aren't going to do that, you would have to do num1 equals num1 plus 1. That's a little bit more tedious to write out. In the end, like doing this isn't a requirement at all, but it's something that helps to keep your code a little bit more concise. And you'll notice you can do it with actually all the different operators. So you could do like minus equals and it would subtract the values. You could do multiplication equals, you could do divide equals, you could do modulus equals. I think you can even do exponent equals as well. So it works with all those different operators. So you can keep that in mind that that's another like concise way to be able to write it. So you can think of this as saying like add what comes on the right hand side to what is on the left hand side. So that's sort of the way to think about that sort of equation. So this gives you an idea of some of the different operators that exist, and this gives you a little bit of manipulation that you can do with the variables and inputs that you get from users. So this gives you some of the basic sort of ideas of what you're able to do inside of Python when you get numbers and values from users.